This video series starts with a discussion of the elementary ideas of basic classical symbolic logic and serves as something of a crash course for beginners and refresher course for those who've had any experience with basic symbolic logic in the past. So it's sufficient to guide people who put their minds to it and who are already somewhat adroit mentally. It will definitely be sufficient to facilitate the understanding of anything I have to say in the meta logic or other videos, especially those which will follow from now on after this series. So continuing on then, we'll go into the video's content matter now, and we'll start with a discussion of logic as a decision procedure methodology. So it's a methodology of constructing decision procedures concerning the truth or falsehood of arguments. And arguments are a series of statements concerning which we may say they are either true or false, and such that it is sufficient and minimally necessary to have two statements acting as premises, so that, and this is essentially syllogistic logic, but it's more than that in that there are further considerations of proof and and it's definitely post-Aristotelian modern logic. But basically, what a syllogism is where two sentences and their truth values will allow one to establish a third sentence and its truth value with absolute certainty, and that's a deduction. So you deduce from the premises to the conclusion, and that's an argument. Well, that's a deductive argument. There are other kinds of arguments. But this basic kind of argumentation process is pretty much the core of what constitutes logical thinking, certainly in ordinary human thought and ordinary language thinking that people do about most matters which they're capable of thinking about. In fact, the range is hypothetically complete and exhausts the domain of everything that can be logically considered. But at least certainly wherever modifications are needed, they will have to be made. There may be exceptions to some aspects of logic in certain domains of consideration, like quantum computing might require that we disregard certain logical rules that work in other circumstances, but not in that one. But there must be certainly sufficient amount of the logical apparatus left intact so that we can understand that basically we're not really looking at an exception to logic as such, but we're looking at a context in which the reality out of which logic was born requires of us to accommodate its difference from the rest of the reality that surrounds it in one place. So, in other words, we're following the rules of the reality that we study, and we consider the exception itself a variation on the rule in some way. And so we treat it with that same amount of respect. So, in the consideration of parts of logic which may vary depending on what we're studying or what we're talking about, we just accommodate the phenomena and try to ask ourselves, how do we properly think about these things in the first place? Upon discovering how we think we properly do think about them, we try to figure out what would be the optimal way of thinking about them given certain conditions and given certain expected results. And we develop a logos for that. And the general form of logoi that are possible to the human mind in terms of certain types of thinking process or certain types of belief reliance system formulation, or in terms of certain types of experiences, or in terms of certain types of knowledge or intuition, It depends on the content, whether it is moral or ethical, whether it is objective or subjective, transcendental, immanent. All these features come into play in deciding what logos is appropriate for that phenomenon, and that will be constructed around the needs of understanding that phenomenon, and so there is an adaptation to the phenomenon. But the adaptation is a bridge partly constructed of the subjective features of understanding, which logic itself studies as a phenomenon. So that's how the system of logic is best formulated in the broadest context. But the logic that we'll look at is sufficient for the discussion of the basic Gnostic analysis of the core of philosophical theory, as it then enables us to discourse on the humanities and the praxeology of human affairs in a way constructive toward the end of demonstrating a certain feature about the world with absolute certainty. And that's the objective here, and the logic that I'll be teaching in these videos is sufficient for that. And so, considering first the idea of truth, if the idea of truth is still a bit unfamiliar for you, or if you're not sure what I mean by it, just take it to mean the opposite of false. Take it to be the state 0, but I don't like using that. But just take it to be state alpha, and take falsehood to be state beta. And in this logic, those are the only two possible states of any of the objects in the language of logic. The objects being terms which will represent sentences and their truth value, or claims about what's real and their truth value, their veridity. And so the issue is to properly structure, to properly symbolize our statements so that we can then, in an abbreviated form, construct manipulations of their logical form so that we can figure out what we can know from it, just like as if it were a machine. And so the idea is that, while yes, reality as we think about it is much more than our formal logic declares, we may still proclaim certain things about that phenomenon with absolute certainty once our logic is able to describe enough of it accurately within a certain context. Again, restricting ourselves to the context of ordinary language and the phenomena accessible to philosophy, the humanities, and the issues that I'll undertake in the praxeology. This basic classical logic will be sufficient, with some modifications which I'll be making, none of which are fundamental. So starting off with a discussion of the way logic works, think of it like a machine, or think of it like a game. It's like a machine or a game. It's a behavior that our mind performs in order to process an understanding of what it considers formally. So in order to process it formally, what it's basically doing is recreating it, the issues at stake in its consideration in whatever venue or format, and it's trying to model them and represent them in a way that's amenable to interior manipulation, so as to simulate outcomes or outcomes of what to expect, outcomes of what to believe, outcomes of what must take place or what might take place, what should take place, and so on, to figure out what really happened as opposed to what just might have happened, to sort out the fact from the fiction and the truth from the false. In this regard, the game of logic is to come up with some rules at the beginning that tell us what we can know for certain, and to follow those rules consistently, and then try to apply it to circumstances where the information we put into this formula is appropriate. And so that's the game we'll end up playing. As a machine, you would say that the content of the sentences would be the fuel and other raw materials loaded into the machine in the energy source, and the form of the logical operations upon those sentences into different types of arguments would be the operation of the machine, and then the output, or the final result, which should be some constructive form of enhancement of our knowledge, would be the output of the machine. The game's rules would be the same as the machine's programming, and the game's participants, as it were, would be the same as the inputs of material and energy into the machine. The output of the game, the result, would be fun. You end up getting exercise and health and things like that. And the result of, except this would be in a mental form and not a physical form. So if you enjoy logic, you can actually think of it as a game. If you want to think of it as a tool for accomplishing demonstrations or proofs and that sort of thing, or just organizing knowledge in a clearer way and in a compact way, then you can think of it as a machine for formalizing knowledge in its ordinary form into a compact symbolic form that readily miniaturizes and then enables whatever is in the content of the mind of the person creating it and using it for that purpose, and then it readily unpacks information as well. And it's a good way of schematizing how we think too. It's a good guide by which to quickly assess matters that to which it can apply. And so, and it's a good way to also just test our thoughts, wherein our thoughts are already logical. Therein, logical formulae used to represent them when tested will discover for us with the same certainty, the certainty we had for arguments we performed in our minds. So it's actually useful as a technique for testing thoughts and ideas. With that, we start with the idea of sentences being reduced into some form. Let's say I want to say, well, let's think of an example. Well, let's just say that the cat is on the mat. So the cat is on the mat. That's all one sentence. And the sentence has parts where we have the subject and the predicate, which is actually all of this. But the important part of the predicate is the verb, which connects the subject to the predicate. Predicate's what we're saying about the subject, or of it, and the verb is also. And usually, and always some verb is involved in the sentence. In this case, the subject, the cat, is in a state of being. What particular state of being? In this sentence, the cat is on the mat. So it's a statement about the cat of a certain sort, and it has a certain truth value. If we don't mean by the cat, we could say that we could just symbolize that as one notion, say A, and then we've got B. The relation of A to B is formed with this verb and this preposition, on, and its relation to another object, the mat. So there's two conditions already. So it has being, on. Like I could say there is a cat, or there is the cat on the mat. So I could say there is a cat. So it's a statement of being. Then I get it on the mat. But I say the cat. I can say there is a cat. The cat is on the mat. So basically, this is a statement of pure being. And then further, it's a qualification of that being as it has a certain relationship. It is on the preposition, and it's on something. It's not on like a light, but it's on something. What? The mat? Okay, well, then the mat is the object which it is on. It's the place that the cat's related to. in its state of being as being on. So here, if that's true, then all these elements will be true. The place where it's at will be true. The relation to that place will be true, and the fact that the cat exists at all will be true. We're not talking about the cat in any other way than that it exists. It's in relation to some place by being on it, and that place is a certain mat. There are also other ways this could get tricky, but there's no need to get into them because the whole point is just to give us the basic sense. The intuition will be worked out as I make demonstrations in each case where I formally symbolize a sentence. So in this case, if A relates to B, with all these conditions being true, then we could say this sentence is called C, and then give it a truth value, and that truth value will be T, true, or alpha. And then if it's going to be beta, then we're going to have to give it the truth value false. And that's if any of these things aren't true. And also this one in a certain way. May as well get into it. What the heck? When I say the cat, I have a certain cat in mind. Okay, so let's just say that the cat I have in mind is the cat. Now the thing we want to know about it and think of as the sentence is this consequence attached to it. We don't just go, the cat doesn't mean anything. The cat. We mean more than that. We mean the cat something. So the cat is on the mat. So this whole thing, the integrity, rests on whether or not it is. So let's say I see a cat. There's a cat. A cat is. I'm going to assume it's the cat he's talking about. Let's say that's true. Now, it's on the mat. The cat is. I see it. The cat is. The cat is on something. I think I'm making something out. I'm not sure what it is. A rectangular shape of some kind. The mat. Okay. So it definitely is. It's on something, and that turns out to be a mat. So yeah, that's all true. Therefore, it's true. So let's just say C, which is this whole thing, is true. But let's say the cat the person's talking about is this other cat that's on a mat. Well, then it's not this one. A cat is on the mat, but not the cat that he's talking about. And that would be false. I mean, all this is true, but not of what he predicates it. Therefore, this would then be false. This has to relate to this. The subject has to relate to the predicate exactly as described. That makes a sentence true. Otherwise, it's false. So let's establish that the cat, in fact, is on the mat, and so it's true. And we want to just put that in the form C, and we've saved ourselves all this writing and all this space. And while that might be handy for the reasons I've described already, the real handiness is that we're not studying cats on mats. And we're not studying a great deal else right now. Right now we're just studying logic itself, how thoughts are formed in certain types of thoughts are formed symbolically and then arranged in a way that's supposed to be the equivalent of what form it obtains of that kind of structure in the thought structure that generated it. So it's a replication of that, symbolized outwardly with basically all the assistance that writing provides our mental processes in so many other ways. But what we've done is we've condensed it so that the form is, so now anything called C, if it's true, it could be a cat the cat is on the mat, it could be chocolate is sweet, it could be carrots and sticks are the means by which people are conditioned. It could be all sorts of, just whatever you want to make, and then you could use C, or you could use any of the other, any general letter of the alphabet, make it a capital letter preferably for the style that we'll be using to represent a whole sentence. And further also, these can be qualified more in more ways, but basically simply, that's a sentence. Here's its two possible truth values. in the logic we're using. It's very conventional to our understanding. Now, there are five main operators in logic. The five main operators are, first of all, we have not, to show as a right angle, and that will go on the outside of any sentence that it modifies, or any statement, or aggregate of sentences that it modifies in that way. Now, let's say that we had a statement such as this. The cat is on the mat. Left alone, if we weren't thinking about it logically, it might not need to be ascribed any truth value. But technically, this is saying something that I'll explain further in a minute. It's saying not that. So there's the operator for any statement. It's not true if it's true. So really, this is a statement with an operator, and that operator is being operated upon. All right, and that operation is the same as just the statement in its basic form. So in that sense, also, while it typically operates on a statement, technically it's operating on an operation on the statement, which makes just as much sense intuitively. And it might seem weird to think of it that way, but let it be true. So if in fact there is some statement that is already contains an operator and two other statements within it, so that this statement and this statement are related by this operator, then this operation is not operating on this state, and it's not operating on that state. It's operating on the product, the truth value product of their truth values. So this has a truth value. We'll find out what it is, whatever it is, and this does too. And then this operates on those truth values and gives us some resultant truth value. Well, then whatever is directly outside of this brackets, which in this case should actually be parentheses, that's the first one we'll use, and that's the innermost. Well, then this is operating on that operator. And truth be told, this is operating on a truth operator for each of these. I mean, in other words, just as if this is operating really on this operator. Operations are on the truth values of statements, not on the statements themselves. In these five operations, I'm not operating on the sentence. I'm operating on its truth value. I'm operating on this part, not the sentence. But if I write this in this way in relation to a term, which represents a sentence, then I'm operating on its truth value, not it. I'm not changing. But of course, I'm claiming that this is this whole entire entity. This is now a term that's true. All right, and if that is true, then that has a truth value, right? And that's being operated upon whenever I operate on that term. In this case, this operates on this term by operating on these values whenever they occur. So, in the case where we have a sentence, say C, and that's its truth value is stated to be not, so it's actually true, that's its truth value. And this would be the falsification of that. And so the truth is falsified. So then this is false, and this is true. So so basically, in a situation where this is true, to add this term makes it false. If this is false, then to add this term makes this true. Because truth and falsehood negate each other. And how that's represented in a truth table, which is like a diagram of a machine, a logical machine, is like this. So let's take the terms to be, let's take the term to be C, and we'll just look at the truth values of the possible truth values of C are what? What are the possible truth values? It could be true, or it could be false. That's it. Nothing else for us here. And then I'm wanting to take C over and then make it. If I leave it as is and I input these values, well then they'll just come right over, and they do. So that means it's true and it's false in every universe where I just restate, where I just input these values into this term, and then I say instantiate the term, and then, well, then these values will be instantiated for it. Whenever this happens, this will happen. When this happens, this happens. It's true in the input, it will be true in the output. It's false in the input, it will be false in the output, because these are identical. But if I add an operator, which will be not, so we're going to define the not operator, then the truth values are, well, since this says true, it's negated, then the truth of this is going to actually be false. That goes under the column which is directly assigned to and directly underneath the not operator. But if in fact we've declared the input to be false, and therefore that the term C is false, by negating that truth value, because we're negating the truth value, then in fact it's true. So in fact we can just say, okay, so if the cat is on the mat, then it's false to say that the cat is not on the mat. Cat's on the mat, so the cat's on the mat. End of story. But someone says the cat's not on the mat. The cat's under the mat. Or the cat's on the couch, but it's not on the mat. It's on the floor. Or the cat doesn't exist. Well, in that case, if they say that, but we know that it's true, well then that's false. Given that C is true, not C is false. Now, given that C is false, then not C, the truth, the negation of the truth value is true. So if it's the cat is not on the mat, then it's true to say that it's not true that the cat is on the mat. The cat's not on the mat, false. The cat's on the mat, false. Then it's not true to say that the cat's on the mat. It's true. Not true to say that it's false. Therefore, if we say that it's not true, that's true. That part's true. The negation is true. So there's an implicit, separation here where once this operation is added, that's the truth value we're interested in. Before, when there was just the variable itself, well, the truth value just translated over, so we didn't need to disregard anything. But now we're looking at the truth value applied in addition to the status quo of the truth value of the sentence. That becomes the focus of our attention, and it is that which is actually the truth table's output or result. That's actually the truth function which describes this operator for every single use that it can ever have in basic logic. So that would be the not operator. And that's a unary operator. It operates on one total term. However complex that term is, it just operates on the whole thing. that means it operates on the foremost operator of it. If it's a series of terms with different operations, okay, it operates on the one that's outermost, that has the widest scope over all of the elements in the sentence, which is a formula consisting of sentences and logical relations. And the outermost one, which covers all of the other elements, however they have been already related, and then gives a final result for the truth value of that compound sentence, compound formula. That operator is the one which would then be operated on by a negation, if a negation were added to all as a whole, not counting if you modify inside of it. Okay, so that's not, so we're done with that one. Let's do the next easiest one, which is and. And this will be simply symbolized by an ampersand. And there. Ampersands are difficult to make well for me. You know a good one when you see it. Now let's take two, because all the other four are binary operators. They have to have two terms to relate. And we'll take this to be, we'll just say A and B. This is trusty old A and B. There we go. Now, if those are going to relate, let's get some distance. We'll put them over here for, there we go. Now, if those are going to be related to this truth function, so this truth table, this will just tell us and give us the ability to decide based on the inputs what the outputs will be, and then from those what the value of this this operator upon them will be, no matter what their truth value. So basically, you could always have true, false, true. Well, basically, let's do it from the outside in. So we're going to get every permutation where this is true for this, and we're going to get every permutation where this is false for this. There will be 4, so, and there's a formula for how this, so let's say the top 2 are true, just like with not, it was true and then false, so true and alright, so basically falsehoods in there. Alright, true, true, false, false. Now, this one will be the next one over, and it's just going to divide those in 2 so that basically those will flip. And so it'll be true, false, true, false. And that gives us cases where both are true, each one is true, reverse of the other, and both are false. All right, those inputs carry over and translate into these, the actual machine's function performance here. It's going to function now and decide for us what are the truth values of this statement, given these truth values, these truth values, these truth values, and these truth values, for this operator. So we're defining the operator. And so that will be true, that will be true, that will be true, that will be false, that will be false, that will be true, that will be false, that will be false. And it turns out that what and means is defined here as a relation of these truth values, just the way not was for its particular definition. And that is that it's true whenever both A and B are true. So whenever their truth inputs lead to the instantiation of the truth of each of those terms, then the compound of them related through the conjunction operator will, what's called the and, but the conjunction operator will be true. But this will not be true of those if their truth values are any of these others. In other words, where one or both of them are false. So if let's see, we'll get an example. If the cat let's say that the white cat is on the mat. Or, yeah, the white cat is on the mat, and we're going to make A C. Just put it out. Okay, so the white cat is on the mat. Let's break that up into two statements, because we can talk about the truth value in a compound way, can't we? We can say the cat is white and it is on the mat. So the cat is white and it is on the mat. So I'm looking over there and I see a cat. It's a white cat, so that's true. Now, is it on the mat? If I see that it's on a mat, then that's also true. Then it's true to say that the white cat is on the mat. If I mean by that, the cat is white and it is on the mat. Now, if it turns out that any of the other conditions obtain, then it's not. In other words, I see that it's a white cat, but it's not on the mat. False. The cat is white and it's on the mat. False. It's not true because it's not on the mat. And I just said the cat's white and it's on the mat. Well, it's not on the mat, so it's false. In the case where it's a black cat, it's on a white mat, so I can see it. But I said the white cat is on the cat is white and it's on the mat. Not the cat is black and it's on the mat. So while it's true that it's on the mat, it's not true that it was white. It's black. So that means it's false to say that the cat is white and it's on the mat. How about the case where I see a black cat, but it's not on a mat? Well, then it's false to say that I see a white cat, and it's false to say that I see it on a mat. So it's false to say that I see a white cat and it's on a mat. It's not true. So that's the only case where that's how the AND operator works. In fact, we can just go ahead and take out the operator and its truth values and leave all the rest. Now, it's got a lot easier. Well, what's another operator after that? Well, let's look at the disjunction operator, which is called inclusive OR. And it's this. And the question is, how do we interpret that? Well, what's the meaning of OR? Well, that's defined simply as saying that the only case where this can be false is when both are false. So with AND, we could just define it for its truth and then just negate all the rest. Here we define it for its falsehood and negate all the rest. So if it's not false, then it's true. That means it's true in all these other cases, what we're saying. And that's what we mean by OR. So an example would be either my hat is red or I'm holding a red marker. That would be a true statement. Now, am I holding a red marker? Doesn't matter, because we've defined that, okay, my hat is red mark. I'm holding a red marker. My hat is red, or I'm holding a red marker. All right, so my hat is red is true. So this is true. If I'm also holding a red marker, I am. But it's also true if my hat is red and I'm not holding a red marker. And I'm only holding this marker. Put the red one down. So it's false to say I'm holding a red marker. But it's still true that this, and so for this operator, it's true. Now what if I weren't wearing a red hat and I happen to have a red marker? I said it says I'm wearing a red hat or I'm holding a red marker, so it's still true. But if it turns out I'm neither wearing a red hat nor am I holding a red marker, then it's false. And that's the OR operator. So we've got not, we've got negation, which is also called not, we've got conjunction, which is also called and we've got disjunction, which is also called or, but here inclusive rather than exclusive or. Exclusive or refers to ambivalence, as I use it. But in this case, we've got 3 of the 5 operators, so the next operator will be my favorite, and that's implication. Not the only one that's more interesting than it first seems, but it's the most interesting one for me, and it's way more involving than it first seems. But simply here, in the way that it's defined simply, and without any further context, and in just this simple way, it's going to have 4 possible truth values, just like the others, just like the other basic operators that are not the singular operator, which is the unary operator negation. The truth value for this, it's true most of the time, actually. It's just as true as inclusive or, statistically, if you will, in a logical sense. It's true in all these other cases, but this is the non-trivial, well, the least trivial case, and perhaps the most interesting case where it's true. And this is the only case right under it where it's false. It's the only case where it's false. And these are the 2 most interesting outcomes for implication. What implication tends to be saying is that if C is true, then B is true. Or another way to say it, if C is true, then B is not false. And that's the way people often do mean it. When they say, if C is true, then B is true, that can be derived from conjunction. If you know that conjunction is true of C and B, then you know that if C is true, then B is true, because that will be true here. But what's interesting about it is that this is particularly false, and just like in conjunction, because we can have this be true, but then we cannot have this be false. This could be true, but this cannot be false. That will be false. And also that's true of conjunction. But what's not true of conjunction is the case that these 2 are also true, because that's what's true for implication. And so what we're really trying to eke out here is the sense that what's important is that falsehood of the consequent does not occur ever at the same time, in the same information state, at the same logical time, as in the same instance where the antecedent or the antecedent is true. In a sense, we want these truth values to depend on each other in just this way, so that for this to be true, then that means that non-trivially, where least trivially, where the antecedent is true, then the consequent is not false. It is also true. It gives the sense of these are not both okay possibilities when the antecedent is true. No. When the antecedent is true, we demand that the consequent be true in order for the operator implication to be true. So in other words, in order for C to imply B, when C is true, B must be true and cannot be false. Now, of course, in the other cases, because this is what makes implication false, whenever the antecedent is true, it's false rather, it doesn't matter whether the consequent is true or false, because this state change was not constricted over the domain of, did not impact the truth value over the domain of false antecedents, but only of true antecedents. And then the falsity of the consequent is ruled out for this to be true. So this is really, for understanding implication, the most important aspect of understanding implication is understanding it where it is false, in order to get the general idea of what it means. So let's take what for us would be an intuitively untrue example, and then find a way that it can be true. Intuitively, it's not true to just say something like, if that's a black cat, then it's not on the mat. Well, if that's a black cat, then it's not on the mat, might be true. Anytime I look at that black cat, I see a black cat. That's true. And every time I see that it's not on the mat, which we'll say is B, it's not on the mat. That's true. But one of these days, I see it on the mat. Well, then it's not true to say that if it's a black cat, it's not on the mat, because there's a black cat on the mat. So intuitively, that can be falsified. But how can we make it sort of trivially true, so that if that's a black cat, then it's not on a mat. Well, let's say that I'm bringing a cat home. If there's a cat in my home, then it's not on the mat. Let's say I'm bringing a cat home, and I'm bringing home a black cat. And well, in that case, if I'm bringing home a black cat, then it'll be true at some point to say that there's a black cat in my home. But that's the only cat I'm referring to, so I just say there's a black cat. And then it'll always be in the house. It's a house cat, it stays in. So I can say that if it's on a mat, it's going to be in my house on a mat. I don't have a mat in my house. Therefore, if there's a black cat, it's not on the mat, will always be true. It will not be. It's impossible for it to be false, but it's thinkable for it to be false, right? What if I brought a mat home one day and forgot it, and I just kept thinking that it's true that if there's a black cat, it's not on a mat. So I'll never walk in my house and see a black cat on a mat, according to my previous experience. What's the first thing I see when I come home? That cat's already gotten real comfortable on that mat. So it's false that it's not on the mat. The black cat is on the mat, so it's false that it's not on the mat. That makes it false to say if there's a black cat on the mat. So it's an artificial kind of certainty when you constrain the domain of possibilities artificially. But that's offset by our intuition that it's conceivable that other situations could be the case. That's a further addendum to the discussion on possibility and impossible worlds for our metalogical discussion, which is the first video in that series. And it's a foretaste of further discussion on those topics later in issues of modality, possibility, necessity, actuality, and potentiality. But in this case, we're going to leave out modality. So let's look at another case. The black cat is not on the mat. Because there is no mat. Well, then it's hard. If there's a mat available in the house, it could be easily falsified. But if I don't bring a mat home ever and there's no mat, then I know that it will never be able to get on the mat. So I know in a sort of artificial way that it's impossible to falsify it. I'm not really predicting anything profound because there's no mat for it to be on. So there are ways in which the inputs we choose can constrict the significance of using this operator. In another way, let's say that I don't own a cat at all, but I have a mat. And I'll say if there's a black cat, it's not on the mat. Well, there'll never be a black cat because I don't have one, whether I have a mat or not. So I can be on the mat. Heck, if I have a mat at home and we look and when we walk in the door, there's no cat on it. That's only a surprise if you didn't know that I don't even have a cat, much less a black cat. Or let's say I have a white cat instead. I'll say that if there's a black cat, it's not on the mat. Well, there's a white cat. That makes this false. That means if it's on the mat or not. So I see a white cat on the mat. That's not shocking because that's a fulfillment of the prediction that there will not be a black. If there's a black cat, it's not on the mat. Now, if I said if there's a black cat, if I said there's a white cat, it's not on the mat. In that case, this would be true. That means it could easily be on that mat, and I'd be proven false. unless there was no mat, in which case this would be constricted further and it couldn't be false anyway. But in this case, if it's false, then the truth value, if the antecedent is false, because either I don't have a cat or it's white instead of black, then it's being on a mat or not, whether it's possible to be on one because there is one or not, they're both they're irrelevant to the original meaning of the term and the implication. So because that's false, well, and that's the reason why in that case that if the antecedent is false, which is the question of the existence of a white cat, or rather a black cat, so I have a white cat instead. So it's false that I have a black cat. Then naturally, whether if it's true to say that it's on a mat, which would be impossible. There's a cat on the mat, but it's not a black cat. So if there's a black cat that is on the mat, well, it can't be on the mat, so that's a strange outcome. But because this is false, this outcome, which is strange to conceive, because we have a compound sentence of the cat, we could then specify better the example and say, let's see. Well, I like this one. If my pant leg's wet, then it's raining. Or how about this? Yeah, if my pant leg's wet, it's raining, right? So I'm standing somewhere and I notice that my pant leg's wet. And let's just say I lost track of everything that was going on around me. I'm standing in a bus stop and start noticing that my pant leg's wet. I come out of my meditative state and I realize, well, I think to myself instantly, well, my pant leg's wet, it must be raining. And then, so my pant leg's wet, and then it must be raining. So pant leg is wet, must be raining. Or let's just say my pant leg's wet, it's raining. I feel it's wet, I check, and my God, it's raining. Okay, true. And then I think to myself, no wonder my pant leg is wet, right? Pant leg is wet, it's raining. But what about a situation where my pant leg's wet, but it's not raining? It's false. Well, then I can't just go from my pant leg to it's raining. What would be a good example of that? Well, my pant leg might be wet. It's not raining because some thing which I had in my backpack, on the pocket on the side of the backpack, began leaking and was pouring all over my leg, and I didn't notice. So my leg, well, oh, it must be raining. Oh, no, it's not. Then of course, it might be raining anyway, and I might think that my pants leg is wet and it's not. Oh, it's dry. Or in another case, it's raining anyway, but it has nothing to do with my pant leg in that case. It could still be that whenever I find that my pant leg's wet, I find that it's raining, maybe. So this won't rule that out and lets it be true, you might say. In other words, if this is true, then this will let it be true. This won't, but this will. If it turns out that my pant leg's dry, well, and it's not raining, well, that doesn't do any harm to the idea that we want to always strictly correlate a wet pant leg with it being raining. There are unpleasant examples of why your pant leg may be wet and it's not raining, and that has a whole lot to do with the current state of affairs in the world, which I'll get into in the praxeology, of how they can convince you that the reason your pant leg is wet is because it's raining, even though they happen to be pissing on your leg. So we'll get into that. But that's one of the cases where pant leg is wet. Maybe it's raining, but maybe it ain't. But it ain't because it's raining. It ain't because it's raining. Because even if it weren't raining, your pant leg would be wet. See? So it ain't for the reason they said. And that's an important kind of gesture toward the future discussions which will take place in the axiology, and also some issues of the metalogic which will prelude it. And then the praxeology will be built out of that discussion with a brief interlude of the overview of the humanities. Another example, just to flesh it out some more, and perhaps this is the most coherent of them, and one of my favorites, is, okay, if it's raining, then the streets are wet. If it's raining, the streets are wet. In fact, let's just stick with the tradition of trying to make the terms somewhat resemble the ideas. This is where the empirical bleeds into the logical, and the content bleeds into the form. So, it's raining, the streets are wet. Raining, the streets are wet. So, raining and the streets are wet. And that's pretty intuitively true, right? If it's raining all over the city, that way, then the streets are wet. So, if it's raining all over the city, true, the streets wet, true. Now, what would make that false? Well, obviously, if it's raining all over the city and the streets are not wet, well, then that would be false. Yeah, that makes sense. We put the right data in here. We didn't say something like, if the moon's made out of cheese, then the streets are wet. All right, so since we could always posit that it's not, it would always be true to say if the moon's made out of cheese, then the streets are wet. That would be a waste of this logical operator. Then we'd have to find out that, the only way that could be untrue would be if we found out that the moon was made out of cheese and the streets weren't wet. I mean, the only way we'd know for sure, as long as we believe that it might be made out of cheese, why then, we must see wet streets. But if we ever see wet streets, that doesn't prove that, if we ever see wet streets, or if we ever see dry streets, that doesn't prove that we got this situation, that the moon's not made out of cheese. That just proves that if it's not made out of cheese, then it's something that we may as well have thought was true anyway, because the important thing for knowing whether the streets are wet or not, it has no correlation with whether or not the moon is made out of cheese. So no wonder. It's made out of cheese, the streets are wet, that's for a completely different reason. Because whenever it happens to be false that the moon's made out of cheese, the streets will be wet or not. And then that doesn't affect the truth. And if it turns out that the moon's made out of cheese, and one day the streets are dry, why, that just shows that the moon being made out of cheese isn't the reason why the streets have to be wet. Because, look, they're not wet, and it's made out of cheese. Look, that didn't make them wet. Wow. So we didn't go, if the moon's made out of cheese, then the streets are wet, right? We said, okay, let's make something meaningful be the antecedent. So we'll say, if it's raining all over the city, then the streets are wet. Now we're getting the hang of it. It's not trivial. It's kind of an inference you could make. A child has to learn it at some point before it dawns on them that it's true. But you have to learn it at some point. It's not trivial. It's part of the it'd be an interesting kind of thing to ask you in order to build up your emotional response. Say if you were a Nexus 6 or something, and I was trying to figure out if you're, or perhaps you were an older model, and I'm trying to figure out how I might ask some sentimental questions about rainy weather or something, and then say something like, "It's raining, the streets are dry," and freak you out, But let's say that it's raining all over the city and the streets are wet. Nexus 6 could get out of it if I said, okay, well, that makes sense, right? Like, yeah, sure. But it turns out that you find out that it's raining all over the city, but the streets are dry. Nexus 6 would go, well, that makes this original statement false. That means that this is not true of it's raining all over the city and the streets are wet. Okay, well, it just falsifies Same, and then they'll say, okay, well then, why do you think that is? Well, it could be for any. A Nexus 6 would say it could be for any number of reasons. It could be because the streets are completely covered over by enclosures that prevent them from getting wet. It could be that what we mean by the streets are most of the streets or some of the streets, whereas therefore it could be that some of the streets are dry and not wet, and therefore that's sufficient to make it false to say that all of the streets are wet. There's all kinds of ways they could say, well, of course this is false. It doesn't surprise them at all. Someone who is frustrated by being tricked by that, like a weaker model of, not so intelligent model of Nexus 6, or a lesser, I don't want to say skin job, synthetic human. A lesser one would perhaps be upset by being caught in a trap like that. But generally speaking, it's a pretty probabilistically true statement to say that if it's raining all over the city, then the streets are wet. We kind of know what we mean. We mean most of the streets, right? So let's just modify it and say most of the streets are wet. It's raining all over the city, then most of the streets are wet. That means even if some of them, then how could that be false? Only if they were completely dry, or if we set up a condition where the amount of dry street, square feet of dry street, is past a certain thresholds that falsify saying that the streets are mostly wet. And we'll define that, and that would help us understand what we mean by it's rain all over the city. Then it's true to say that the streets or most of the streets are wet. And that helps us make sense of how this operator is used in terms of what would be the antecedent and what would be the expected consequence. And when people discuss things in a way that says that something that is the antecedent, if that's true, then it is implied that the consequent is true. That's most arguments that you ever encounter, because in fact most arguments are a collection of statements or arguments even that are built up, and it is said at some critical point that if these are all true, then this cannot be false. And therefore we know that if these are all true, that this is true. And they're saying that this is true. And they're saying that they're so sure of it that you can put it in this form and you'll never have a problem where this will be true and these will be false. And they claim to be able to demonstrate that, to show that it's really undeniable. Well, obviously, if we just set up a situation like with the cat and the mat, where there's no way that it can be falsified because there's no cat at home to be on the mat or not, or it's a different color than the one we assigned, or there's not a cat or a mat, so there's no way it could be falsified. Then we're cheating ourselves out of the real meaning and function of the implication operation. What we're trying to set up is the notion that barring any spurious restrictions on what the input is, barring any tricks of rhetoric, barring any kind of confusions about the matter, we're saying that we found two things such that if we know that the former is true, then the latter cannot be false. And when a claim like this is made, there can be some consequences that are very important, and they can be tested. And we can continue confirming this and build up a great mountain of certainty and know exactly what it hinges upon, and then know how to test it further and further strengthen it, or find out where it might be weak. And as long as it's actually some system of implications that integrate a sense of knowledge about what's real, and it seems to correlate with the evidence very strongly, we seem to be in a powerful position to justify this behavior whenever it comes to trying to predict events, or including to predict what the causes of events were if we come up to the aftermath. But if we see the preconditions or precursors for a result that we would anticipate would always come about if these preconditions were present, then we could say the preconditions represent a building probability of this being true enough that a certain consequence will result, given this reaches that sufficient critical point. And that would be a causal prediction about the future. Including that if you keep studying logic, then you're eventually going to understand more and more clearly how all of its procedures are designed to work and what they accomplish in terms of thinking and argumentation and many other roles that these tools, thinking and argumentation, play in society, besides what are discussed generally in philosophy or logic, to be as narrow as possible, extend all through the culture where people use language to negotiate situations, including persuading one another of things and trying to elicit responses in their declarations or in their actions, which we prefer to others. So obviously the implications for politics, law, scientific theory, practical action of all kinds are contained within the proper use of argumentation as can be logically defined, even though it's not restricted to that. Likewise, however, the sense of logic is built so completely around the idea of implication in some important sense that it really is the most important. It is the quintessential operator of our concern, in my view. And that's and the way that I do utilize it in the arguments to come will fully bear that out, because it will be certainly true in the cases where I have use of it. So yeah, I mean, if it's not raining, then on days when it's not raining, I notice that the streets are dry, so this doesn't surprise me. But what about whenever it's not raining and the streets are mostly wet, or all wet? Well, then there's got to be a reason for that, and then it's not because of the rain. But that doesn't mean that this has any contradiction with the issue that I've stated, that whenever it's raining, the streets will be mostly. There could be another reason why they're mostly wet. Maybe there's some kind of flood which came from upstream and then deluged the city, or a tsunami on a day when it wasn't raining, for any number of reasons. Maybe there's a special sprinkler system set out for some reason to help clean the streets. Yeah. In fact, street cleaners will wet the street and then scrub it down with their street sweep machines. So that goes on a lot. Those vehicles doing that, they spray water and then they sweep it up. That happens. So there's a lot of reasons why the streets can be mostly wet and it's not raining. So it still makes sense intuitively to our inputs. Raining all over the city and the streets are wet, even though we falsified the antecedent. And that intuitively makes sense in it, and according to the definition of implication, it fits logically. So we see that there is some meaningful correlation between implication and cause and effect, which is worth considering. They're not the same exactly, but at all, but they're very analogous in some respects. It makes it very important. And the final operator, well, let me leave that in place, and let me just leave it as it was. So this is the truth value, the truth function for implication. Now, the final operator of these five is the biconditional, which is also dual implication. And the only way that it changes the truth value of implication is in one place. And that makes false. All right, so basically just implication is still true. That's why this arrow, into the arrow is kept. The biconditional arrow is kept, so that will be true. And this will be true symmetrically, because all this is saying is that if this is true, then that cannot be false. So if that's false, that can be false. If this is true, that cannot be false. So it's basically just taking the implication. If the streets are all wet, then if it's raining. it's raining, and making that true along with if it's raining, then the streets are all wet. That means that in this case, if it's raining, then the streets are all wet. If it's raining, then the streets are all wet, and also if the streets are all wet, then it's raining. Therefore, it will be false if either of these are true and the other is false, because that's an implication that's false going in that direction. That's an implication that's false going in that direction. That's one. True and then false. If the streets are all wet, then it's raining. It's false because the streets are all wet and yet it's not raining. If the streets, and therefore, I'm saying that there wouldn't be any other reason for the streets to be wet. So there is no, I'm ruling that out. I'm saying that I'm not really ruling it out, but I'm making a tighter bond with the antecedent, because I'm saying that the antecedent being false does matter. It matters in case the consequent is not also false. Because I'm saying that if the consequent is true, if the second term in the biconditional is true, which makes it the antecedent of its own implication. In other words, that's by including in the that's basically combining both of those. And to put it less intuitively, that's simply saying, to make it rigid and linear in one direction, that's basically accomplishing this. Everything go in the same linear direction, and then it's really taking both of those, and this isn't how we would write it. I'm just saying that these two would then be operating on each other with the and. Work on that. So if both of those are true, then that's true. In fact, I could make an implication arrow to that. I'm saying that the definition of this is that this is true and this is true. So I'm saying, and I'm making an implication. I'm saying if this is true and this is true, the and is, if the conjunction of these two being true is true, which means those both have to be true, then this cannot be false. We can test that just by making a truth table for this statement, and doing the same, and then seeing if that will be false wherever that's true. And we can do that as a final act of trying to clarify what all these operators mean. Instead of trying to do it abstractly, we'll just look at it on its own truth table. Move on. So, making a massive truth table, and only needing two terms. Let's make it rain and the streets are wet. So I'm saying that if it's true that then I'm saying it's true that and of course values are nothing new here. Let's start with this one because we know that's the permutation number of, well, that will always be that way no matter how far down you have to go. So basically you're going to go down 2 if it's just 1, like we did with not. And now we've got with one term. We've got 2 terms, so we've got to go 4. And that's going to be the number of possible truth values to the power of the number of terms. 2 to the second power is 4. And so there, now we're going to add the 8 next time. And it's going to be true. True. Also, we can start with the inside term. I'm just making a different point about it when I started with the outside term. And then the inside term will always be true, false, all the way down, alternating. The next one will double the iterations for each term, and the next one will double if there were a third term, say some term C, then it would be all 4 of these are true, and then there'll be 4 more that are false. This will be repeated once, and this will extend all the way down. At this point, we just input the truth values. This is where you see how it's like a machine. I'm not going to think about it. Like, I'm literally not. I'm taking all the rules of the operations that I know, that we know so far, and I'm just going to apply them to the truth value inputs, going through the machine procedurally. So it's a decision procedure. So I'll just find all the cases where that's true, make it true. It's going to be true there. It'll be true there. And that's done. And it'll be true again. And it'll be false. It'll be false. True again. False. Nothing tricky about it. And then, of course, the streets are completely wet, or whatever quantification you want to apply to how wet it is. All right, got all that. And so we'll use black for the intermediate truth values. Obviously, we know the functions of these operators, and we know, so we'll just start with the innermost operator. What are the innermost, the most nested, the most deeply nested terms? Yeah, this side and this side of the main operator. All this implies this. You know, it's like X implies Y. So these are premises. If that's true and that's true, then I can deduce that that's true. So if we already know that this is going to be true, false, true, true, and that's going to be not the same because of the way these are permutated. So it's actually going to be, well, we know that what the conditions require. Right? That's true. And in fact, we did make the permutations carry over. We don't have to think in terms of the original schema, which shows true, false, true, true. We just got to know the condition. So I know that's true. I know that's true because it's false. I know that's true. So this has to be true, false, okay, false. True, true, false, true. And true, false, true, 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 false. It makes sense because of the way that those variables flipped and these remain the same. So what flips is the entirety of the true, false, true, 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 false, true. It makes perfect sense. And of course, now finally, we also know that if these are both true, then that's true, and that's false because those are not both true. They're not both true, so that's false. And these are both true, so it's true. True, false, true, true. That's how that goes. So that's for the and, the conjunction. And we know that we had assigned the definition of biconditional. That's the definition we gave it. And that is that if they're both true or both false, then it's true. And if it's one's false and the other's true in either possible way, then it's false. Now we ask ourselves this question. Is this statement, which is as a whole designated by the conjunction's truth value, if that's true, is this ever false? Well, that's true. That's true. So no. So that part of the implication is true. That's false. And that's false. So no. That if that's false, then that's false. That's true also, because this is not true and this false. This is false, but this is false. This is false, but that's false. This is true and that's true. And they're both true, which makes it true. That means that in all cases where I make this the antecedent, or the antecedent, x, and I imply y, if this is y, then the implication will hold true. Always. That means this is absolutely true. And of course, since we know that these variables, these truth values here, rather, for this operator's truth, and these for this one are identical. That means if we made y the if we likewise reversed it and made y the antecedent and x the consequent, we know that it would be true as well in the other way. And that tells us that if this is true, then this is true. Then, if this is true, then this is true. Which means technically, makes perfect sense. Because that's true. Because that is the definition of biconditional. And this is always true when biconditional is true. And biconditional is always true when that is true. Whenever the conjunction of converse, a conditional and its converse, when their truth values are assessed through conjunction, it's true and false exactly whenever a biconditional, using the same terms as true or false, when in the same information state, same inputs. It's always true. And that means that this is logically true. It's always true in every case where the logic exists and these terms are constant over these formulae and these operations are used, that this is true. And it just bears out that in every possible way logical inputs can be made for these formulae, that's true. That satisfies our definition of knowing this, imply that, and knowing that the conjunction of a conditional and its converse is true, then that implies that the biconditional is true, and that if a biconditional is true, we found, just by recognizing the truth values would be the same here as here, and therefore so with the consequential implication, that means therefore that this biconditional also implies the conjunction of a conditional and its converse. And therefore, this is another biconditional. That means that biconditional implies, or is implied by, the conjunction of conditional and its converse, and the reverse. It implies a biconditional, a rather conditional and its converse. So we get a biconditional straight out of biconditional, which is pretty good, pretty neat. There are many cases where that won't happen. That just demonstrates how true that is. At first, we started with just the confidence that that this would be enough to give us a biconditional, and it was enough, because when this is true, this was never false. We also found that when this is true, that can't be false, right? Because it's the definition. So we know that this would be enough. It's sufficient. Also, why? It's sufficient to give us the antecedent as well. So we know that they're biconditionally related. And in general terms, whenever the antecedent implies a consequent, and that's true, we can say that the antecedent is sufficient to imply the consequent, and that the consequent is necessary. It's necessarily, rather. Well, we don't say necessarily, but it's necessary for the, it must be necessarily true in order for the antecedent to imply it. And we say that when that's true, then the antecedent is sufficient to guarantee the truth of the consequent. course, if that implication is false, then it's not enough to guarantee it, and we'll end up finding, possibly thinking at least, conceiving a reasonable alternative of truth value for that consequent, which tells us, no, it's conceivably false. And then we can form kinds of knowledge which are more and more universal, more and more specified, and can be expressed in every form in accordance with the phenomena's requirements. So those are the 5 logical operators and their relationships according to truth values of true and false. And that's sufficient introduction in logic in order to proceed with the meta logic.